You have built your training around a number, a green circle, a readiness score, a recovery percentage that appears on your wrist or your finger every morning and tells you, with the calm, data-driven authority of a device that never sleeps, never misses a night, never stops collecting, whether today is a day to push or a day to rest. Millions of people have done this. Whoop subscribers in the tens of millions. Oura Ring users across hundreds of countries. Garmin athletes who check the HRV status tile before deciding whether the interval session goes on the schedule or gets moved. The consumer wearable HRV market has grown into a multi-billion-dollar industry built on a single foundational promise: that the number your device produces from the intervals between your heartbeats overnight can tell you, with meaningful accuracy and reliable validity, how recovered you are, how ready you are to train, and when you are at risk of the overtraining that athletes most want to avoid. That promise is partially true and partially not. And the part that is not true is the part the marketing never discusses. The part buried in the sports science literature, the physiology journals, and the device validation studies that the wearable companies cite selectively and the content ecosystem rarely reads carefully. I want to give you the most complete, most honest, most practically useful account of what heart rate variability actually measures, what the research says it reliably predicts, where the prediction breaks down, what the specific problems with consumer wearable HRV algorithms are, and how to use this data in a way that is grounded in what the evidence actually supports. This is not a video that tells you to throw your Oura ring in the ocean. The HRV data your device produces has genuine value. The question is what that value is, where it comes from, and where the gap between what the device claims and what the research supports is wide enough that following the advice uncritically is costing you training quality, not protecting it. Let me start with the biology, because without it, none of the rest makes sense. Heart rate variability, HRV, refers to the variation in the time intervals between consecutive heartbeats. Your heart does not beat with the metronomic regularity of a clock. The interval between one beat and the next fluctuates continuously, and those fluctuations are not random noise. They are the output of a continuous, dynamic interplay between the two branches of the autonomic nervous system: the sympathetic branch, which accelerates heart rate and prepares the body for action, and the parasympathetic branch, which decelerates heart rate and promotes recovery, rest, and the repair and regulatory functions of the resting state. When the parasympathetic nervous system is dominant, when you are well recovered, unstressed, and the body's internal environment is conducive to repair and adaptation, the heart rate variability is high. The intervals between beats fluctuate more, reflecting the active, dynamic modulation of heart rate by a nervous system that is operating from a position of physiological safety and capacity. When the sympathetic nervous system is dominant, when you are under stress, physically or psychologically, when you are insufficiently recovered, when you are ill, when your body is in a state of physiological strain, heart rate variability is low. The intervals between beats become more regular, more metronomic, less dynamically modulated by the parasympathetic system, whose inputs are being suppressed by sympathetic dominance. This is the foundational biology, and it is real. The relationship between parasympathetic activity and HRV metrics, specifically the RMSSD, the root mean square of successive differences between consecutive heartbeat intervals, which is the metric used by virtually every consumer wearable in the market, is well established in the physiology literature. RMSSD is a robust, validated, non-invasive measure of parasympathetic nervous system activity. This is not in dispute. The research on this is solid and spans decades. The autonomic nervous system validity of HRV, the claim that RMSSD reflects the balance between sympathetic and parasympathetic activity, is real and supported. What is considerably less solid, considerably more contested, and considerably less frequently communicated to the consumer who has spent hundreds of dollars on a device and is following its daily readiness scores, is the translation of that autonomic measurement into the specific training and recovery decisions that consumer wearable brands market the devices for. Let me be specific about where the evidence does and does not support the promises. The use of HRV, tracked over time, with personal baselines established, using trends rather than day-to-day single values, as a general health biomarker is genuinely supported. The research on resting HRV as a predictor of cardiovascular health outcomes over years and decades is substantial. Lower resting HRV is associated with elevated all-cause mortality risk, with elevated cardiovascular event risk, with worse outcomes in cancer, with higher rates of anxiety and depression, and with a range of physiological and psychological health indicators. HRV is a longitudinal health biomarker, tracked in the way that it is most robustly meaningful, as a rolling average over weeks, assessed against one's own personal baseline rather than against population norms, has genuine predictive power for health that the research supports. The use of HRV-guided training, using HRV trends to decide when to schedule high-intensity sessions and when to schedule recovery sessions, has moderate research support for improving endurance performance compared to pre-planned training programs in some athletic populations. Meta-analyses on this specific question have found that HRV-guided training produces modestly better endurance performance outcomes than standardized training plans in studies conducted predominantly with trained endurance athletes. The mechanism is plausible. By using the physiological readiness signal to schedule the highest training loads on the days when the body is best positioned to adapt to them and to preserve recovery for the days when it most needs it, the total quality of training across a period improves even if the total volume is similar. This is an area where the evidence is real, but comes with important qualifications. The research has been conducted predominantly in trained endurance athletes. The evidence for resistance training populations, for mixed sport athletes, for untrained or recreationally active populations, and for the vast general consumer base that Whoop and Oura are actually selling to, is substantially thinner. The specific algorithmic translations of HRV data into the training prescriptions offered by consumer wearable apps have not been directly validated in the populations using them. Now let me take you into the specific problems that the research has identified with how consumer wearables implement HRV monitoring and how they translate that data into readiness scores. The first and most fundamental problem is the mathematical relationship between RMSSD and resting heart rate. RMSSD, the measure of beat-to-beat variability, is inherently influenced by the average resting heart rate of the individual. At lower resting heart rates, the absolute interval between beats is longer, and the potential range of variation between successive intervals is mathematically larger. At higher resting heart rates, the intervals are shorter, and the potential for large RMSSD values is constrained by the basic arithmetic of how close together the beats are occurring. This means that the same absolute RMSSD value carries different physiological meaning depending on the resting heart rate of the individual producing it. A highly trained endurance athlete with a resting heart rate of 38 beats per minute and an RMSSD of 90 milliseconds is not in the same physiological state as an untrained person with a resting heart rate of 68 beats per minute and the same RMSSD of 90 milliseconds. The mathematical relationship between their heart rate and their HRV produces the same number from fundamentally different physiological situations. The research solution to this problem is normalization, specifically the use of HRV metrics that correct for average heart rate, such as the RMSSD to RR interval ratio or other normalized variants. When HRV is normalized by average heart rate, much of the mathematical confounding is removed and the metric becomes more meaningfully comparable across individuals and across time for the same individual as their fitness changes. Most consumer wearables do not perform this normalization or do not communicate transparently to users whether and how it is performed. The RMSSD your device reports reflects both your autonomic recovery state and your resting heart rate, and those two contributions are not separated. This creates a specific problem for athletes whose fitness is improving over time. As training produces lower resting heart rates through cardiac adaptation, the absolute RMSSD may increase simply because the heart rate has dropped, independent of any change in parasympathetic activity per se. The device interprets this as improved recovery. The reality is a mathematical artifact of improved cardiovascular efficiency. Conversely, a highly trained athlete with a consistently low resting heart rate may produce RMSSD values that look unremarkable by population standards, even when their parasympathetic activity is genuinely elevated, because the mathematical ceiling imposed by their very low heart rate constrains the absolute value of the metric. Consumer wearable algorithms that compare individual RMSSD values against population-level norms, or that fail to properly account for the individual's baseline heart rate when interpreting their HRV, are producing systematically misleading information for exactly the populations, highly trained athletes, who are most likely to be using them. The second major problem is how readiness scores are constructed. Consumer wearables do not simply report your RMSSD. They transform your RMSSD, along with resting heart rate, sleep duration, sleep quality metrics, and in some devices activity load data, into a single composite score, a green, yellow, or red readiness rating that tells you what to do today. The problem that the sports science literature has identified with this approach is the inclusion of training load and recent activity data in the readiness calculation. Your recovery score should be the output of your physiology. What has your body actually done in response to the training you gave it? When training load is included as an input to the readiness algorithm, the score is being penalized for training regardless of how your body actually responded to it. The score tells you that you trained hard, not whether your body recovered from it. For athletes, this distinction is critical, and the failure to maintain it fundamentally undermines the purpose of the measurement. HRV4 training, the independent HRV app and research platform run by Marco Altini, a researcher with substantial published work in the HRV literature, has made this critique explicitly and repeatedly. The whole point of monitoring HRV is to assess the output of your physiology, your body's actual response to the training stimulus you gave it. When the scoring algorithm includes the training input as a factor, it systematically hides the physiological information that HRV monitoring is supposed to provide. The third problem is the measurement window and sleep stage confounding. RMSSD and HRV values are not uniform across the night. They vary substantially by sleep stage. Slow-wave sleep produces measurably different HRV characteristics than REM sleep, which produces different characteristics than light sleep. The absolute value of RMSSD during slow-wave sleep can be significantly different from the value during REM sleep for the same individual on the same night. Different consumer devices use different algorithms for selecting the measurement window within the night. Whoop uses a specific portion of sleep identified by its proprietary algorithm. Oura uses whole-night averages weighted by its sleep staging algorithm. Garmin devices have historically used a different sampling approach. This means that the HRV values reported by different devices are not directly comparable. They are not measuring the same thing in the same way, even when they report the same metric name, and changes in a device's score may reflect changes in sleep architecture or in the algorithm's window selection rather than changes in actual autonomic status. The 2025 validation study published in Physiological Reports, Dial and colleagues, examining nocturnal HRV accuracy across Oura Gen 3, Oura Gen 4, Whoop 4.0, Garmin Fenix 6, and Polar Grit X Pro against a reference chest strap ECG, found that Oura Gen 3 and Gen 4 showed the strongest agreement for HRV measurement, followed by Whoop with acceptable agreement, while Garmin and Polar showed substantially worse performance. This is valuable validation data. It also confirms that the devices are measuring the same metric differently enough that cross-device comparisons are meaningless, and within, device longitudinal trending is the only valid use of the data. The fourth problem is the confounding of genuine autonomic status by a range of non-recovery-related variables that produce changes in HRV independent of training status. Alcohol consumption, which suppresses parasympathetic activity acutely, produces HRV reductions that can be indistinguishable from training-induced fatigue in the device output. Illness, caffeine timing, hydration status, ambient temperature, stress from work or personal life, the menstrual cycle in women, all produce measurable effects on RMSSD that have nothing to do with training recovery, and that a device algorithm cannot distinguish from genuine recovery-related changes without additional context. For women specifically, HRV follows a predictable cycle-related pattern. HRV is typically higher in the follicular phase when estrogen is dominant and lower in the luteal phase when progesterone rises after ovulation. This predictable, normal, biologically expected variation will appear as a significant negative deviation from baseline in the second half of the cycle, potentially triggering rest recommendations during periods that are physiologically normal and may be entirely appropriate for training. Devices that do not account for menstrual cycle phase in their HRV interpretation are systematically miscommunicating recovery status to female users during the luteal phase. Now I want to give you the framework for using HRV data in the way that the research actually supports, the practices that do have evidence behind them. So this video is not merely a deconstruction, but a genuine upgrade to how you use the tool you already have. The first principle is tracking trends over weeks, not responding to daily scores. The research on HRV-guided training is based on weekly rolling averages and systematic deviations from personal baseline, not on single-day values. A single low HRV morning can reflect nothing more significant than poor sleep positioning, an extra cup of coffee the evening before, or a slightly cooler room. A sustained downward trend in your weekly average HRV, persisting across 5 to 7 days, is a physiologically meaningful signal that accumulated stress, whether from training load, life stress, inadequate sleep, or illness, is being reflected in your autonomic state. The evidence-based response to a single low HRV reading is, note it, check it against context. Did you drink alcohol last night? Did you sleep poorly? Are you fighting something off? Are you in the luteal phase of your cycle? And make training decisions based on how you feel in context rather than on the number alone. The evidence-based response to a week-long declining trend in your HRV average, combined with subjective feelings of fatigue and reduced performance in training, is genuine signal worth acting on. The second principle is using your own baseline, not population norms. Your HRV is a personal number. The absolute value is determined by your genetics, your age, your fitness level, your resting heart rate, and dozens of other individual factors. A value of 55 milliseconds is not inherently good or bad. It is good or bad relative to your own historical baseline for the same conditions, same time of measurement, same measurement protocol, same general life context. What matters is not whether your RMSSD is higher than a population average. What matters is whether it is higher or lower than it was last week, and whether the direction of change is consistent with what you know about your recent training load, sleep, and stress. The third principle is combining HRV with subjective wellness ratings. The research literature on HRV-guided training consistently finds that the combination of objective HRV data and subjective wellness ratings, perceived fatigue, mood, muscle soreness, perceived readiness, produces better training decisions than either input alone. A low HRV morning combined with subjective feelings of high fatigue and heavy legs is a strong signal. A low HRV morning on which you feel genuinely energized and your warm-up feels excellent is a weaker signal. The body may be recovering well, despite an autonomic pattern that looks concerning in isolation. The HRV number is one input into a system that includes how you feel, what you see in your training performance, and what you know about your recent history of load and recovery. When those inputs align, the signal is strong. When they conflict, the subjective experience often carries meaningful information that the device algorithm is not capturing. The fourth principle is using HRV for long-term autonomic health monitoring rather than for day-to-day training prescription. The research on HRV as a longitudinal health biomarker, predicting cardiovascular health, tracking fitness improvements, identifying periods of chronic stress or illness, is considerably stronger than the research on HRV as a day-to-day training prescription tool. If your rolling 4-week HRV average has trended downward by 10% over 2 months during which your training load has been high and your sleep has been compressed, that is genuinely useful information about accumulated physiological stress. If your score dropped from 72 to 58 overnight after a particularly stressful Wednesday meeting and a glass of wine, it is not useful training information. The fifth principle is device selection based on the evidence, not marketing. For the specific purpose of overnight HRV measurement, the application with the most research support and the most favorable signal-to-noise ratio, the 2025 Physiological Reports validation study places Oura Ring at the top of the accuracy hierarchy for consumer devices, followed by Whoop with acceptable performance. For users with darker skin tones, the PPG optical bias documented in validation studies, the green light LED in all current consumer wearables penetrates darker skin less reliably, producing higher error variance, means that a chest strap ECG-based device like the Polar H10 for specific measurement sessions provides more reliable data than any optical wrist or finger sensor. Before the practical framework, I want to spend time on the positive case for HRV data, because this video is not designed to produce nihilism about a tool that has genuine value. The research on resting HRV as a longitudinal health biomarker is among the most consistent in the entire cardiovascular medicine literature. Lower resting HRV is an independent predictor of all-cause mortality. It predicts cardiovascular events. It is associated with worse outcomes across a range of chronic disease states. It tracks fitness improvement reliably over months and years of training. A large 2025 multi-study analysis across 5 longitudinal cohorts found that Wearable measured resting HRV showed meaningful associations with HbA1c, a marker of average blood glucose, with depressive symptoms, and with sleep difficulty, even after controlling for known confounders. The signal is real. The health information in the trend is real. What the 5 longitudinal studies also found was that the associations were small to moderate in magnitude. HRV is a health indicator with genuine predictive power, not a diagnostic certainty with clinical-grade precision. A sustained decline in your rolling HRV average gives you probabilistic information about your current physiological state. It does not tell you with certainty that you are overtrained, that you are about to get sick, or that you are at elevated cardiovascular risk. It tells you that your autonomic balance is shifted towards sympathetic dominance in a way that, sustained over time and combined with other information, warrants attention. The athletes who get the most value from HRV monitoring are the ones who have used it long enough to understand their own patterns. They know what their HRV does the morning after a hard interval session. They know how it responds to a week of high training load. They know what alcohol does to their score. They know the signature of an oncoming illness in their HRV data because they have seen it multiple times. The specific pattern of a 2 or 3 day progressive decline before the sore throat arrives. That kind of experiential calibration, built on months of collected personal data, is genuinely useful. It is the version of HRV monitoring that the research most strongly supports. What the research does not support is taking a single morning readiness score at face value and making training decisions primarily based on it without the personal baseline, the contextual awareness, and the combination with subjective data that make the tool meaningful. The device is a data instrument. The intelligence required to interpret the data is yours, not the algorithm's. The green circle on your wrist has genuine value. It reflects something real about your autonomic nervous system that the research supports as a meaningful health biomarker. But it does not predict your overtraining risk with the precision the marketing implies. It does not provide reliable day-to-day training prescriptions for the populations using it. It does not distinguish between the multiple non-recovery confounders that produce HRV changes, indistinguishable from training fatigue. And its absolute values are not comparably meaningful across individuals or across devices. Use the trend. Use your own baseline. Add context. Add subjective data. Track weeks, not days. And stop letting a single morning number determine whether you push or rest today without asking what else might be producing it. That is how HRV data actually helps you. And it is more useful, more honest, and more practically valuable than the version the Wearable company is selling. Let me close with the specific protocol that the research supports for getting maximum value from HRV monitoring with the devices most people already own. Measure at the same time every morning, before you get out of bed, before caffeine, before any significant movement. The measurement conditions matter more than many people realize. HRV values taken in different positions, at different times of day, after different amounts of movement or stimulation, are not reliably comparable to each other. Consistency of measurement protocol is the single most important factor in producing reliable, within individual longitudinal data. Track a 7-day rolling average, not the daily score. Review your weekly average every Monday morning. Compare it to your average from the prior week and from the prior month. Deviations of more than 5 to 10% below your personal rolling baseline that persist across 3 or more consecutive days warrant attention. Single-day deviations warrant only context checking. What happened yesterday that might explain this? Record a brief subjective wellness note alongside each morning's HRV reading. Perceived energy level on a 1 to 5 scale. Perceived muscle soreness. Mood. Sleep quality rating. This takes 30 seconds and dramatically improves the interpretability of the HRV number. The combination of objective autonomic data and subjective wellness perception outperforms either alone in the research, and it costs you nothing to add the subjective layer. Identify your personal confounders. Spend 30 days tracking your HRV against variables like alcohol the night before, training session type and intensity the day before, sleep duration, and for women, cycle phase. You will quickly build a personal map of what moves your number for reasons unrelated to training recovery. And once you know those patterns, you can weight the daily reading against its likely causes, rather than treating every low score as a training warning. Use the long-term trend for health assessment, not just training prescription. If your 4-week rolling HRV average has declined during a period of high work stress and poor sleep, that is health information as much as training information. The research on HRV and cardiovascular health, on HRV and metabolic markers, on HRV and psychological well-being, all operate at this time scale. A sustained suppression of your HRV baseline over weeks or months is a signal worth taking seriously beyond just adjusting your training load. It is a signal about the total physiological cost of how you are living. The device is a tool. Like any tool, its value depends entirely on whether you understand what it measures, what it does not measure, and where its output requires human interpretation to become useful. Used correctly, with personal baselines, with contextual awareness, with subjective data alongside the objective number, and with attention to trends rather than individual values. HRV monitoring is one of the most practically valuable continuous health measurements available to anyone without clinical equipment. Used as the marketing implies, a daily green circle that tells you whether to train, it is, at best, incomplete. And at worst, it is a number that restructures your training around measurement artifacts rather than actual physiological signal. Know the difference. Use the tool accordingly.